Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about something I think is super interesting, something you've all probably experienced but might not have a name for. And it's called the Dunning-Kruger Effect.
Yes.
Have you ever, met someone who is just way too confident in their abilities?
Yeah.
Or maybe you've been that person yourself.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That could be Dunning-Kruger in action. We've got a bunch of research on this, and it's actually really fascinating stuff. So,
It is.
yeah, let's dive right in.
Yeah. So what's really interesting about this is that Dunning-Kruger, the psychologist who kind of discovered this effect back in 1999, they found that it's not just about being overconfident. Highly skilled people can also be affected by this, but in kind of the opposite direction.
Oh, interesting. So like a confidence seesaw almost.
Yeah.
But how does that even work? I feel like usually when you're good at something, that boosts your confidence.
Mm.
So why would being really skilled make you underestimate yourself?
Yeah. That's a great question. And that's where this idea of the curse of knowledge comes in. So, experts often assume that a task is really easy for everyone just because it's easy for them. So they underestimate their own abilities because they have trouble understanding the gap in knowledge that other people might have. Imagine like a professional chef thinking that anyone can just whip up a souffle because it's so easy for them. But for us regular folks, it's
Not so much.
not that simple.
Yeah, totally. I get that. So it's almost like they forget what it's like to be a beginner, which then makes sense why they would underestimate themselves. But then on the other hand, we have the people who are, let's just say, a little bit too confident.
Hmm.
Where does that come from?
Right. Well, that's where the ignorance of ignorance comes into play. And basically what that means is that people don't know enough to realize just how much they don't know. And that can lead to these really inflated self-assessments. In fact, in the original research study, they had people rate their humor, their logic, and their grammar skills. And the people who scored in like the bottom 12%, they actually thought that they were above average.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's got to be a tough reality check when that hits. Speaking of reality, the source that we were looking at mentioned some pretty impactful real-life examples of this, like with new employees.
Yeah.
Have you ever started a job thinking you had it all figured out, only to realize pretty quickly that you don't?
Oh, yeah. All the time.
Yeah.
It's classic Dunning-Kruger. And that initial overconfidence can lead to some interesting decisions. The source actually mentioned this case study where this new hire was so convinced that they were a marketing whiz that they launched this whole campaign that just completely flopped because they didn't really understand the target audience at all.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen that happen before. That's a level of confidence I aspire to avoid. But then there's the other side of this where, the source also mentioned this thing called imposter syndrome. So even when you're objectively successful,
Yeah.
you still have all these doubts about yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
I've definitely experienced that too.
Think about that coworker you have who's super brilliant, but they're always downplaying their achievements. They're probably struggling with imposter syndrome, which a lot of times is actually tied to the Dunning-Kruger effect. They're just so used to such high standards for themselves that they can't even see their own brilliance.
Wow. So it really seems like this bias can affect you, no matter where you are on the skill spectrum.
Yeah, I
That's
get it.
why.
It really affects how we learn the decisions that we make, even our relationships. The source talked about how in romantic relationships, one partner might consistently overestimate how much they're contributing to the relationship, and the other partner might constantly underestimate what they're bringing to the table. And this can create all these feelings of resentment and imbalance.
Yeah, I could see that.
Well,
This isn't just some abstract psychology concept. This is actually playing out in our lives all the time.
I have to admit, I've definitely related to both sides of this. Like, I can definitely remember times when I started a new job, and I was just so excited I thought I was going to crush it. And then there are other times where I felt like a total imposter, even though objectively I was doing a good job.
Right. It's human nature. But I think the good news is that becoming aware of this effect is kind of the first step towards overcoming it.
Okay, so knowing is half the battle.
Yeah.
But how do we actually break free of this confidence trap? Well, there are a bunch of different strategies that are proven to be really effective. And I think the key is to kind of move from this state of unconscious incompetence, which is where you don't even know what you don't know, to a state of conscious incompetence where you're actually acknowledging your limitations.
So it's about recognizing our blind spots. That makes sense. But how do we even find those blind spots in the first place?
Well, one of the best ways is through feedback. You can think of feedback as like a mirror that reflects back what you might not be able to see yourself.
Okay, feedback makes sense, but I have to admit, sometimes asking for feedback can be tough. It feels a little bit like opening yourself up to criticism, which isn't always the most fun feeling.
I totally get that. But the thing is, constructive feedback, even if it's a little hard to hear at first, it's really valuable for growth.
Yeah.
It can help you pinpoint those blind spots that we were talking about, and it can give you really concrete steps to actually improve.
So it's less about feeling bad and more about actually getting better. I like that reframing. But do you have any tips for how to get good feedback in the first place?
Yeah, for sure. One of the best things you can do is to be really specific. So instead of just asking someone, how am I doing? Try asking something like, what are your thoughts on my presentation style? Are there any areas that I could improve? Targeting your questions that way can help people give you feedback that's more focused and more useful.
That's a great tip. Like, tell me what you really think about these slides. So we're getting specific with our questions to get better feedback. But even when you get good feedback, isn't there still that risk of taking it personally?
That's where humility comes in. And humility isn't about being self-deprecating or anything like that. It's about recognizing that we all have room for growth. See feedback as a gift, not some kind of personal attack.
Okay. So humility can help us be more open to feedback. But what about those times when, even with good feedback, we're still stuck in that mindset of like, I know everything. How do we get past that?
I think the best antidote to that is continuous learning. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. And it can be a humbling experience, but in a good way.
That's so true. I remember I was taking this coding class a while back. And at first I was like, I got this, I'm a tech person. But then the deeper I got into the course, the more I realized how much I actually didn't know about coding. It's kind of exciting, though. It's like opening up this whole new world.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of learning. It keeps us curious. It keeps us growing.
Yeah.
And it helps us chip away at that Dunning-Kruger overconfidence.
I like that, chipping away at it. Okay, so speaking of learning, the source that we were looking at also mentioned something called metacognition. I'm not going to lie, that word always kind of throws me off a little bit.
Yeah, it sounds a little intimidating, but it's actually a pretty simple concept. Metacognition basically just means thinking about thinking. So it's about becoming aware of how your own mind works, how you learn best, and what your biases might be.
Oh, okay, so it's like stepping outside of yourself and observing your own thought process.
Exactly. And the more you do that, the easier it becomes to catch yourself in those Dunning-Kruger moments. Like maybe you notice that you jump to conclusions before you have all the facts, or you realize that you tend to overestimate your abilities in certain areas.
That's really interesting. I can see how that would be helpful. But it also sounds like it takes some practice to get good at that.
It definitely does. But there are actually some easy ways to start incorporating metacognition into your daily life. Like, for example, you could try taking a few minutes after a meeting to just reflect on how you contributed. Did you dominate the conversation? Were you too hesitant to share your ideas? Just paying attention to those kinds of patterns can be super insightful.
That's a great tip. I'm definitely going to try that one. The source also mentioned measuring progress as a way to kind of combat the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Right. Tracking your progress can give you concrete evidence of your growth, which can help you counter both overconfidence and imposter syndrome.
So instead of just relying on your feelings,
Yeah.
which can be kind of unreliable sometimes, you're looking at actual data.
Exactly. So let's say you're trying to get better at public speaking. Instead of just thinking like, oh, I think I did okay, you could track things like how many presentations you've given, how engaged your audience seems to be, or even like feedback scores from people who have seen your presentations.
It's almost like you're taking the guesswork out of self-assessment. But what happens when the data shows that you're not as good as you thought you were? Can that be kind of discouraging?
It can be, but I think it's also a really valuable opportunity for growth. We're all works in progress, and the key is to use that data to figure out where you can improve, not to beat yourself up about it.
So it's all about turning that data into action. Like, okay, maybe I need to work on my presentation openings. What can I do to make them more engaging?
Exactly. It's about shifting from this fixed mindset where you think, I'm either good at this or I'm not, to a growth mindset where you think, I can always get better with effort and feedback.
I love that. That's such a powerful shift in perspective. And it makes me wonder, what are some of the benefits of actually overcoming the Dunning-Kruger effect? Is it just about feeling more confident?
It's so much more than that. The research actually shows that having this balanced confidence, the kind that comes from really knowing your strengths and your limitations, it can lead to better decision-making, stronger relationships, and even greater success in your career.
Wow. Okay, so it's not just about feeling good. It's about making better choices, connecting with people more authentically,
Mm-hmm.
and achieving more. That's pretty motivating.
Yeah, it's really about becoming a more well-rounded and effective individual.
I like that. Who wouldn't want that? It really feels like understanding this whole Dunning-Kruger thing can change how we see so much in our lives.
For sure.
Like once you learn about it, you start seeing it everywhere.
Right. It's hard to unsee it.
And that's got to be a good thing, right?
Yeah. Thanks.
Awareness is always the first step.
Ex-
And I think it's pretty cool that even though this effect can trip us up sometimes, it's not like a permanent part of us, you know? It's something we can actually work on and change.
Yeah. It's not a fixed trait.
That's a relief. So it's not like, oh, I'm just doomed to be overconfident forever. There's hope for us all.
There's always hope.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all this?
You know, I think the source said it really well. They had this line that really stuck with me. They said, knowing what you don't know is just as important as what you do know.
Oh, I like that a lot. It's like admitting you don't know something isn't a bad thing.
Exactly. It's actually a sign of strength.
Right. You're acknowledging those knowledge gaps.
It's about being open to learning.
So it's really about embracing that lifelong learning journey, knowing that there's always something new to discover.
And being okay with not having all the answers all the time.
You know, it's funny, though, because it feels like sometimes we're taught to think that admitting you don't know something is a weakness, especially at work or in professional settings.
Totally. It's like there's this pressure to always appear competent.
Right. Exactly.
But honestly, I think the most successful people are the ones who are willing to say, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn.
That takes a lot of courage.
It does.
But it's so important.
Yeah.
It all comes back to that growth mindset that we were talking about earlier. And that makes me think about how we can apply this to our own lives. You know, we've learned all about the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah.
We've got all these strategies for overcoming it. But how do we actually turn all that knowledge into lasting change?
Right. Well, I think it starts with taking those strategies that we talked about and incorporating them into our daily routines.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be anything huge, you know. Start small.
Yeah.
Like maybe you commit to asking for feedback on just one project that you're working on, or you block out some time each week to learn something new.
Right.
It's all about making it a habit.
Little by little.
Exactly.
So it's not about being perfect right away.
No, not at all.
It's about those small, consistent steps.
Right.
I can do that.
And don't forget to celebrate those wins along the way. You know, each time you catch yourself in a Dunning-Kruger moment, or you push yourself outside of your comfort zone to learn something new, acknowledge that progress. It's those small victories that keep you motivated.
Those little wins add up.
They really do.
I really enjoyed this deep dive. It was so eye-opening. And it's definitely made me think about my own experiences with this whole Dunning-Kruger thing.
Me too.
Yeah, I can definitely remember times where I've overestimated or underestimated myself.
We've all been there. It's part of being human.
It is, but what matters is that we're aware of it now.
Exactly.
And we have the tools to handle it better.
And that's a powerful thing.
It really is. So as we wrap up, is there one final thought that you want to leave our listeners with?
I just hope everyone listening leaves feeling empowered. Empowered to embrace their strengths, to acknowledge their limitations, and to approach learning with a sense of curiosity and humility.
I love that. And remember, everyone knowing what you don't know is just as important as what you do know. So keep questioning, keep learning, and don't be afraid to ask for help. That's what this journey of self-improvement is all about.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the Dunning-Kruger effect. Until next time, stay curious.